Video games, movies, and TV all share something in common: CGI. And as we can see right here, the amount of detail and the quality that CGI has these days is absolutely phenomenal. So it makes sense that when you first start learning this stuff, or if you're trying to figure out how this generally works, it's a little bit overwhelming, or it might seem rather impossible. But once you break this all down into more simple components, you'll realize that everything we're looking at here is actually very doable. And it's not as bad as you might think. So in this video, I'll be demystifying CGI. And if you're somebody who's trying to study CGI or learn how this generally works just out of your own curiosity, then this video is for you. And here to kick off our journey into CGI is my friend Oliver, the graphic designer. However, this picture of Oliver is just an illusion. If we zoom into this, we'll quickly notice that all we're really looking at here is a bunch of squares. These squares are called pixels, and any digital image that you look at is made up of these pixels. So when you're looking at something on your phone, or on a computer screen, or a monitor of some kind, you're looking at pixels. And the end goal of CGI is to make these pixels, is to show you imagery. Because at the end of the day, if you're talking about video games or film, it's all just a bunch of pixels that show you an image of some kind. Once you understand pixels, the next question is, how do things move around? This right here is really cool. It's the round hay garden scene, which was filmed in 1888, and it's one of the oldest videos still in existence. So as we can see here, this is nothing more than just a bunch of photos that are flashing before our eyes really fast. The speed at which this is happening is called the frames per second. And if we have enough frames, enough pictures that flash before our eyes, we get this illusion of movement. If we take a look at these bearded reedlings, we can see these different frame rates in action. At 60 frames, everything is lifelike, so realistic that it makes some people uncomfortable. 30 frames per second, this is where we're used to watching films, 30 or 24. And this is normally what we see things in. But at 15 frames per second, this is when things begin to break down. But it's not entirely uncomfortable to watch yet. That doesn't happen until you reach 7 frames per second. This is when things really start breaking down. It's still video, you can still tell what's happening here, but once we reach 4 frames per second, this becomes uncomfortable to watch. And in my opinion, the illusion is now completely broken. Here's the thing though, you don't need a camera in order to do this. Steamboat Willie in 1922 was one of the first cartoons ever created. This features Mickey and Minnie Mouse, and as you can see, this video is actually just pencil and paper that's being animated to life. So anytime you hear that word animation, think back to this. It's like taking pencil and paper and animating this into a new world or a new thing that looks like it's alive. That's where this word animation comes from. Now today that word gets used all over the place. It's not just this two-dimensional animation, but that's where things originally come from. Fast forward all the way to 1963 with this, which is a simulation of 2 gyrogravity. And this asks the question, what if we have the computer draw these lines instead of people drawing them with hand and paper? This is one of the first examples of creating that 3D illusion with the usage of lines and with the usage of programming computers in order to draw out these pictures for us. This is one of the first examples of CGI. And what's great about this is it really just shows us that this is not very different than what happened with Steamboat Willie. We are using the computer as a sophisticated drawing tool to give us the frames that then turn into pixels that then become what we experience. So if we want to use this sophisticated drawing tool, there are three things at a very bare minimum that need to happen. Number one is you need modeling. That is the creation of shapes and things in your scene. Number two, Lookdev. Lookdev is all about making those things look a certain way. So if you want a CGI object to look like skin or glass or whatever it is, that whole process is Lookdev. And then lastly is assembly and render. Assembly is placing the objects where you want them to be, as well as having a camera and setting that up to where you want it to look. Once you have that, the process of rendering will take that 3D scene and convert what we see into pixels. There are many more specialties than that you can get into, but all CGI, no matter if it's video games, TV, or anything else, all CGI needs at least those three stages. So let's move on to modeling. We'll talk about the history, the main techniques, and take a look at some visual examples. If we go back to the old days of computer animation, we have Ed Catmull, who eventually would become one of the founders of Pixar, and Fred Park, who would become a senior programmer and professor at Texas A&M. They created this, which is a computer animated hand. And what's really cool about it is, at the time, this was one of the first representation of a polygonal model. We don't just have lines and points here. We actually have surfaces that are drawn out in between those lines and points. So when we look at those surfaces, what we're looking at is polygons. And as we can see right here, the process of modeling this used to be that you would create a plaster mold of something, you would write where the coordinates need to be, or the various locations of the polygons on that hand, and then to digitize it, they had to measure exactly the X, Y, and Z coordinates of where those points were located. So we can see that happening right here. Position in space is represented in X, Y, and Z. So this was the old way of defining where you wanted your points to be. It would create a mesh like this, and then polygons would fill in those in-between spaces. Nowadays, we don't need to go through all the hassle of taking the pen and figuring out where the coordinates are for every single polygon. No, instead, there are three main techniques for creating stuff in 3D, or for modeling objects. The first technique is hard surface modeling, the second is sculpting, and the third is procedural modeling. When hard surface modeling, we're talking about the manual creation, extrusion, and movement of individual points. So think about just taking points and taking objects and using them to cut into other objects, or starting with a cube and bringing out faces and moving the points around yourself. Hard surface is all about having that manual creation of the shapes. And just about every single 3D application has some tools built into it to help you make these objects in your 3D scene. The second style of modeling is sculpting. This is where we have an object that lives in 3D space, and we're trying to manipulate it as if it was clay. So as we move the mouse over the surface, it's kind of like smoothing things, adding little strips of clay. This allows us to have a much more artistic hold over whatever shapes we're trying to make. One of the problems with hard surface is that it can make everything feel very rigid and stiff, whereas this gets used for organic shapes such as characters, cloth, things that might need a bit more of a hand touch to them in order to feel natural. And then lastly, we have procedural modeling. This is where we have some rules, we have some logic built into a program that automatically generates things that we need. So in this case, there are some sliders we can move, and as we move those settings or those sliders, different shapes begin to automatically be created. Or as we take a building and stretch it to the side, we can see that it automatically populates windows, balconies, everything that it needs. So procedural modeling is about creating systems that automatically model things for you. Everything you see in CGI goes through this stage of modeling because that creates something in the scene. And even if we're taking a look at water effects or particles or other things, the creation of geometry, whether it's through a procedural means or otherwise, ends up becoming all the various things that CGI is. The next question is, though, how do we make them look the way we want to? This brings us to Lookdev. Now, even though we all love the look of gray polygons, a lot of the magic that we experience in CGI comes down to look development. Check this out. This video here is the complete angler. And this was in 1979, shortly after what we saw with the hand. And this showcases ray tracing, which is taking those gray polygons and making them look differently depending on lights in the scene and depending on the surface properties that are assigned to these spheres. So Lookdev is really two things. It's texturing or shading, that is defining the surface qualities of objects, and lighting. So you place lights in the scene, you tell the objects how they should look, and then we use a lot of complicated and fancy math to eventually figure out how glass would look in that scene, or where a highlight would be, or all of these different things that add realism. So as an example, if I was to put together a very basic scene, it would look like this. I might have, let's say, a sphere in the scene. So there's our 3D object. I just modeled a sphere, if you will. I can then add lights. So I can create a light, and I can move this around. And it's kind of like organizing things as if you were placing them on a stage of some kind. So I have my lights. I can then create a material, and this determines how the sphere is going to look. So I could change the color here, maybe make it red or something. And then when I'm ready for the final render or for the final high quality image, I'll create a camera that creates this little guy that looks at the scene. I will then go up here to the render view, select which camera I want to look through, and press render. And lo and behold, after a few moments, we have a red sphere. And if I zoom in here, we will see pixels. So hopefully now you have a very basic idea of what this looks like from taking something in a 3D scene and converting that into an image that's made up of pixels. Let's now talk a bit more about assembly and rendering. Once you have models, you have textures, you have lights, you have everything you need to have CGI. Now, one thing I want to talk about that is good to recognize is that rendering isn't just for VFX, it's also for video games. But the main difference between VFX and video games is simply the speed at which you render things. So when we look at VFX, stuff like this, one frame could take 10 to 40 minutes typically. It's a lot more difficult to render really, really high quality CGI, and the mathematical formulas they use prioritize slower calculations if it gives you a more realistic result. Video games, on the other hand, will prioritize a different set of math equations that are much faster to calculate. And even though CGI in video games still looks incredible, the quality isn't as high as what we see in VFX because you often need at least 30 frames per second to be generated, rather than one frame every 10 to 40 minutes. That's a massive difference. And so video games has always lagged behind in quality from film, Video games these days have gone in incredible ways at optimizing 3D scenes, assembling things in such a way where it gets rid of stuff that the camera can't see, and it has all kinds of tricks to speed things up. But when we're talking about rendering, video games has a completely different paradigm than VFX because it needs to render so quickly. There are 3 things I recommend doing if you want to start studying CGI. Number 1 is learn from a great teacher. Number 2, study a 3D program. And number 3, choose either photography or classic graphic design to study at the same time. I'll tell you why that's important towards the end here. But let's start with the first one, which is learning from a great teacher. The question is, though, how do you find a good teacher? Now, I could spend a whole video just talking about this because it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. But it really all comes down to this. You want to start by looking for positive qualities. A great teacher makes a difficult thing feel easy and feel simple. They save you time by getting straight to the points. When teachers get straight to the point and they're not extra wordy, that shows you that they're prepared, and that shows you that they respect your time and attention. A great teacher avoids a negative vibe. I've had plenty of burnt out, prickly teachers in my life, and when you're first starting, you don't need that kind of energy. You need to have fun, you need to be, upbeat and everything. So having a great teacher that isn't negative is very important. And they also have a very deep knowledge of CGI. It's not just the desire to teach, but also the skills and the competency that that teacher has, which will make a big difference for you. And last but not least, they also challenge you to think for yourself rather than just having you copy them. So this isn't a follow the leader kind of situation. This is a you are the leader. Now what will you do next? And the teacher is there to help. So make sure that that is the situation when you are studying from a teacher. It's also really important to not prioritize irrelevant things. So the question is, what is relevant? What should you be looking at? Well, take a look at this highly sophisticated diagram I have right here. This is what employers care about when hiring for a junior role. 75% comes down to a demo reel, a showcase of what you can do. 12% of the decision-making process might come from a recommendation if you have one. People always like to trust their friends when hiring new people. And 12% is going to come from your personality. You obviously have to work well with people. You want to be the person that you would want to work with. However, you'll notice that the resume part, that is the actual paper and the bullet points of what you've done and what you know, that only really makes up 1% of the decision making. In the world of CGI, they don't care about your resume as a junior artist. So it doesn't really matter where you went to school, if you went to school at all. It doesn't matter what kind of electives you took. It doesn't matter what your grades were. Nothing along those lines matter. The only thing that matters is, can you do the job? Does someone know you? And do I like you as a person? If you get those 3 things, they will outweigh a resume any day of the week. So when looking for an ideal teacher, they're going to help you with your skills, which will help you make a better demo reel. They can provide recommendations. And along the way, they're not going to turn you to a burnt out, sour person like they are, and your personality will be intact. So that is what you're looking for in a teacher. Now, what doesn't really move the needle, though, is fancy teacher resumes. A lot of teachers like to flash where they've worked or, the projects they've done and all that. That doesn't mean they're a good teacher. Nice pamphlets, nice websites, expensive classrooms. These sort of things are flashy. They get used to market to you. They're there to try to convince you to study at that program or to justify a high price for something. But again, that doesn't always mean That will get you a better looking demo reel or a better recommendation. And flashy projects don't always equal a better education either. There are many teachers and institutions who try to make things look as flashy and awesome as possible, but the problem with that is it doesn't always give you what you need as a beginner. I find that often when universities and other online institutions, when they just focus on the flashy project and say, make this cool stuff, that is not always going to be what you want to do as a beginner. And it's also oftentimes a follow the leader situation rather than an education that empowers you to think for yourself. So just be careful about that as well. And speaking of which, if you guys like my style, then check out cgforge.com. I have courses, resources, I do mentorships. There's everything you need to improve your CGI skills. All right, so we talked about finding a great teacher, but now let's talk about choosing a 3D application. In order, here are my recommendations. Number 1, Houdini. Number 2, Blender. Number 3, Maya. These are the top applications that you want to consider when first learning CGI. Now, at CG Forge, I have tons of Houdini content. So my opinion here is biased, and a lot of people would disagree with me when it comes to starting in Houdini. However, my bias comes with a lot of important considerations to make. It's not just because I teach Houdini, it's actually because Houdini is going to give you a better education than the other programs will. You see, what makes Houdini different than the other applications is the fact that it's going to teach you how CGI works on a deeper level. And people who understand CGI on that deeper level have a much easier time picking up new programs in the future. As a CGI artist, you're not going to stay in one program. You have to learn multiple programs, you have to bounce around, and it's just going to be in your best interest to do so. So if you study Houdini first, then it's going to be a lot easier to pick up anything else you want to do in the future. And for that reason, along with many other reasons, but mainly for that reason, that's why I think Houdini is the best application to learn at first. Now, in addition to a 3D application, I mentioned studying photography and or graphic design. What I'm talking about here is learning Photoshop or Illustrator. Or if you don't want to use Adobe, you can do Affinity Photo or Affinity Designer. Choosing one of those applications is really important because it gives you skills and knowledge when it comes to the direct modification of pixels. A lot of the best CG artists I know have their roots in photography or graphic design, and the reason why they're so good is because they've developed some artistic abilities over there, and they also have a comfort working with pixels, working within a computer application to start with. So that's why I think it's really important to throw that in there as well. One last thing before we go. In this video's description, I have a link that will send you to CG Forge for a free study guide. So if you're looking for practical next steps or specific things to do on a daily basis, I've listed all that out in the guide. I have book recommendations, course recommendations, all kinds of stuff. And by following that, you'll definitely be on the right track when trying to study CGI for the first time. Again, you can download that for free by going to this video's description. My name is Tyler Bay. Thanks for watching. I hope that you now understand what CGI is on a much deeper level, and hopefully this will help set you off in the right direction. Until next time, have a great day.